The night the flames roared through my home, I thought my life was over. Everything I had built, every memory I had protected, turned to ash before my eyes. The fire department said it was an accident, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't fate. It was hate. And in my gut, I knew exactly who was behind it. She had been circling me for months. Every fine, every letter, and every knock on my door was another reminder that she wanted me gone. The HOA wasn't just her playground, it was her weapon, and I was her target. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment she stepped into my courtroom just 1 week later, smiling. Why would the very woman who destroyed everything I owned walk straight into the lion's den? And more importantly, what did she think she was about to get away with? The neighborhood had the kind of charm that could fool anyone. Rows of tidy homes lined the street like soldiers in perfect formation, their shutters painted in HOA-approved colors, their driveways free of cracks, their lawns trimmed to an almost artificial perfection. On the surface, it looked like a dream. For me, it was supposed to be exactly that, a fresh start after years of hard work and saving. I had poured everything into this house. The down payment had taken years to put together, every extra shift, every late night, every dollar tucked away with the hope of one day owning something I could truly call mine. When the keys finally slid into my hand, I remember standing in the empty living room, my footsteps echoing off bare walls, feeling like I had crossed into a new chapter of my life. At first, life here seemed peaceful. The mornings were quiet, filled with the hum of sprinklers and the occasional bark of a dog. Families strolled the sidewalks in the evenings, children rode their bikes in the cul-de-sac, and neighbors waved with polite smiles. It was exactly what I had imagined, a place where I could finally breathe, settle, and enjoy the fruit of my hard work. But underneath that picture-perfect calm, there were things I didn't notice right away. Little cracks, so small I almost ignored them. The first was the welcome packet. Inside, alongside the glossy brochure about community amenities, was a thick booklet of rules, pages upon pages about what you could and couldn't do. Fence heights, paint colors, even the acceptable length of grass before you'd be fined. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just part of living in a managed neighborhood. But still, something about its tone struck me as overbearing. Then there were the looks. Not from everyone, but from a few. When I parked my truck in the driveway instead of the garage, I caught an older woman 2 houses down staring with narrowed eyes. When I left my recycling bin at the curb a little longer than expected, I noticed whispers between neighbors across the street. These weren't confrontations, just small, silent signals that hinted at an invisible line I hadn't learned to follow yet. And then came the letter. It seemed calm, at least on the surface. Just a typed notice in my mailbox reminding me that all trash cans must be removed from site within 12 hours of pickup. It ended with a warning that repeated violations could result in fines. I remember holding that letter in my hands, confused at how quickly the warmth of the neighborhood seemed to fade into rules and enforcement. Still, I tried not to dwell on it. Life was busy, and I had no interest in petty conflicts. I told myself these were minor things, just part of adjusting to a new community. But the truth was, something about it all unsettled me. It wasn't just about rules. It was about control, a quiet pressure that seemed to hum beneath the surface of every interaction. I didn't know it then, but those subtle signs were only the beginning. Because while I was busy building a life inside my new home, someone else was watching me with a very different plan. The first few weeks in the neighborhood had taught me anything, it was that appearances mattered more than anything else here. On the surface, people were friendly enough. They waved when I drove past, exchanged pleasantries when we crossed paths at the mailbox, and even invited me to a neighborhood barbecue in the park by the clubhouse. But beneath the smiles was something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The barbecue should have been a warm welcome, yet I found myself watching the way people hovered in clusters, conversations clipped and careful. Everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, from whose lawn was due for mowing to who had parked their car in the wrong spot the week before. It was like living inside a fishbowl, with every move measured, watched, and quietly judged. At the center of it all was the HOA board. They weren't just names on letters. They were living, breathing figures of authority in the community. There was always at least one board member at any gathering, steering conversations back to rules and standards. It wasn't said outright, but the message was clear: everything here had to stay within the lines, or you'd hear about it. I started to notice how deeply the HOA's presence shaped daily life. Lawn care companies came every Thursday like clockwork, trimming each yard to the same height, ensuring no blade of grass dared grow too wild. Neighbors timed their trash bins down to the minute, dragging them out after dusk the night before pickup and hauling them back in before noon. Even holiday decorations seemed suspiciously uniform, a row of wreaths that looked eerily alike, as though people were too afraid to put up anything that might stand out. At first, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. But then the little run-ins started piling up. One morning, I found a bright orange notice taped to my door. It was a friendly reminder that my front porch light bulb had burned out and needed immediate replacement. The notice ended with a line about how neglecting such small details diminishes the overall value of the community. A light bulb. I remember standing there, the paper crumpling in my fist, wondering how anyone had the time to notice something so trivial. Another day, while pulling weeds in the front yard, a neighbor stopped by to chat. She smiled as she asked where I had bought my lawn chairs, but then, almost in the same breath, mentioned that certain styles weren't technically approved by the HOA. Her tone was casual, almost friendly, but the warning beneath her words was sharp as glass. The more I listened, the clearer it became. This wasn't a neighborhood. This was a stage, and everyone was performing their role to avoid being singled out. People weren't just living here, they were surviving the gaze of an invisible authority that dictated every detail of their lives. And yet, there were whispers about those who resisted. At the barbecue, someone mentioned the Johnsons, a family that had dared to paint their shutters a non-approved shade of blue. The story was told like a cautionary tale, the ending vague, only that the Johnsons didn't last long in the community. When I asked what happened, the subject was quickly changed. I should have paid more attention then. I should have realized that those whispers were warnings and that the same spotlight that had chased the Johnsons would one day turn to me. But at the time, I shrugged it off, convincing myself that if I just kept to myself, followed the rules where I could, and avoided unnecessary attention, I would be fine. I didn't realize that in this neighborhood, silence wasn't safety. Silence was a challenge. Because to someone watching from the shadows, my very existence had already broken an unwritten rule. I didn't fit the mold. It didn't take long before the warnings stopped feeling like random notices and started to feel personal. The first real sign came one evening when I returned home to find another letter taped to my door. Unlike the polite reminders I'd seen before, this one had a sharper edge. It cited a supposed violation. My lawn had grown uneven and unsightly. The phrasing was cold, almost accusatory, as if the few dandelions peeking through the grass had somehow offended the entire neighborhood. At the bottom, in bold type, it read, "Failure to address this matter may result in fines and further action." It wasn't just the words that unsettled me. It was the way the letter had been placed. Not tucked in the mailbox, not slid discreetly under the door, but taped front and center like a scarlet letter for the whole street to see. And that was when I noticed her. She was standing across the street, watering a flower bed that didn't need watering, her eyes fixed on my house. She didn't wave and didn't look away when I caught her gaze. Instead, she stared with the kind of cold curiosity that told me she had been waiting to see my reaction. Her name was Karen, though I didn't know that right away. I would learn it soon enough, whispered by neighbors with careful voices, half in fear, half in resentment. She wasn't just any resident. She was the unofficial face of the HOA, the woman who enforced the rules with a zeal that felt less about community pride and more about personal power. From that day forward, I saw her everywhere. She lingered during her walks, pausing just a little too long near my yard. She stood at HOA meetings with a folder of papers always clutched to her chest, speaking in a tone that left no room for argument. If a neighbor dared question her, the air in the room shifted, and the conversation quickly turned in her favor. I started receiving more letters. A note about a non-approved garden ornament. A small wind chime that had hung by my porch since the day I moved in. Another about inconsistent trash bin placement. Each one felt less like a reminder and more like a declaration of war. And then came the whisper. One night, as I was bringing in the recycling bin, a neighbor across the street called out softly, almost too quietly to hear. "Be careful," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be listening. "She's watching you." He didn't have to say who. I already knew. It was clear now, this wasn't about lawn care, or trash bins, or light bulbs. This was about control. She had chosen me, and for reasons I couldn't yet understand, she wanted to break me down, rule by rule, violation by violation. And yet, there was something darker beneath her actions, something that made my chest tighten every time her shadow crossed my path. It wasn't just about HOA power. It was personal. What I didn't know then was how far she was willing to go. That the petty letters and subtle intimidation were only the beginning. That beneath her polished smile and sharp rulebook was a storm building, one that would soon crash into my life in a way I could never have imagined. Because for Karen, control wasn't enough. She wanted destruction. First fine landed in my mailbox like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about something major, just a claim that I had left my trash bin out too long after pickup day. The paper said I owed $50, due immediately, with the threat of additional penalties if unpaid. $50 for a trash bin. I told myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe it was automatic, a simple mix-up. But when I tried to contact the HOA office, all I got was silence. Calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back with generic responses. No explanation, no discussion, just a fine that had to be paid. I paid it. Not because I believed I should, but because I didn't want to start a fight. At the time, I still believed that staying quiet was the safest path. But then came another. This time for grass height. According to the notice, my lawn had exceeded the approved limit by half an inch. Half an inch. The fine, $100. It didn't stop there. Within 2 weeks, I received 3 more, one for improperly stored tools after I left a rake leaning against my fence, one for non-approved ornamentation because of a wind chime, and one for porch light non-functionality, even though I had already replaced the bulb. Each envelope felt like a fresh wave of humiliation. Every fine arrived in the same stiff tone, cold and detached, like I wasn't a person but a problem to be corrected. The worst part wasn't the money, though it stung. It was the visibility. Each letter was taped right to my front door, in plain sight of anyone passing by. Neighbors would glance at it as they walked their dogs, their eyes flicking from the paper to my face before quickly looking away. I could feel the weight of judgment pressing in on me, like I had been branded a troublemaker. And then I noticed a pattern. Every time a fine appeared, Karen was nearby. Watering her flowers, walking her dog, and chatting with a neighbor at the exact moment I stepped outside to rip the notice from my door. She never said a word. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes told me everything. This wasn't random. This wasn't a mistake. This was targeted. The stress began to bleed into every part of my life. I found myself double-checking everything before leaving the house. Was the bin put away in time? Was the grass trimmed enough? Did I accidentally leave anything out that could be used against me? Living there wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a constant state of surveillance. And the strangest part? The more I tried to comply, the more violations I seemed to get. It was as if Karen was waiting for me to slip, hunting for reasons to tighten the noose. By the end of that first month, the fines stacked up to nearly $500. $500 for petty, manufactured violations. One night, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at the pile of letters, I felt the shift inside me. At first, it had been confusion, then frustration. Now it was anger. This wasn't about community rules. This was harassment, plain and simple. I knew then that silence wasn't going to save me. She wasn't going to stop. In fact, I had the sinking feeling she was just getting started. But I had no idea how far she would go, and how quickly this quiet war of fines and notices would escalate into something much darker. Second month, the fines weren't just an inconvenience. They were becoming a financial chokehold. The notices shifted from petty, almost laughable accusations to bigger, costlier demands. One morning I received a letter claiming that my driveway had developed visible cracks that reduced the overall aesthetic value of the community. The so-called solution? Replace or resurface the entire thing. Price tag, thousands of dollars. The absurdity of it all made me laugh at first, a bitter, hollow laugh. But when I read the fine print, the threat of daily fines until it was resolved, the weight of it sank in. They weren't just trying to nickel and dime me anymore. They were tightening the screws until I broke. Karen's presence became unavoidable. She hovered like a shadow. I'd see her in the evenings, standing by her mailbox longer than necessary, pretending to sort envelopes while her eyes tracked every movement I made. If I had contractors over for even minor repairs, she appeared like clockwork, snapping photos from across the street. Neighbors began to notice, and soon the whispering turned into quiet divisions. Some people avoided me entirely, their once friendly waves replaced with stiff nods or nothing at all. Others still offered polite hellos, but their eyes carried warnings, like they were afraid of being caught on the wrong side of whatever invisible battle was unfolding. And then, there were those who openly sided with her. At a community event, I overheard two residents discussing me in clipped voices. "He doesn't take care of his property," one muttered. "No wonder Karen's on him. She's just protecting the neighborhood." Their words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed exactly what she wanted, to paint me as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. The fines grew steeper. A notice for excessive weeds in my flower bed. A demand that I repaint my shutters, which had apparently faded by an imperceptible shade. Each came with financial penalties, each framed as my failure to maintain the standards of the community. When I tried to fight back, to attend an HOA meeting and voice my side, the board smothered me with procedure. They listened with polite expressions, flipping through papers, only to tell me I'd missed a deadline or filed incorrectly. Karen sat there, stone-faced, occasionally whispering to the board president, as though my fate had already been decided before I opened my mouth. It wasn't just rules anymore. It was control, and she was winning. The pressure bled into my personal life. I stopped inviting friends over, embarrassed by the stack of notices that seemed to grow weekly. My evenings became a cycle of mowing, trimming, and scrubbing, and still, no matter how much I did, another violation would appear. Then came the biggest blow yet. A certified letter arrived, warning me that continued violations could result in a lien against my property. My home, the place I had worked so hard for, the dream I thought I had finally achieved, was suddenly under threat. Not because I had broken laws, not because I had harmed anyone, but because one woman had decided I didn't measure up. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the letter trembling in my hands, and felt the walls close in. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a battle for survival. And deep down, I knew she wasn't finished. Things were one thing. I could grit my teeth, scrape together the money, and at least keep a roof over my head. But what came next went beyond paperwork and envelopes. It was personal. It started small, almost subtle enough to dismiss. A garden hose left coiled neatly against my fence one evening was suddenly stretched across my lawn the next morning. The nozzle cracked as though it had been stepped on. My mailbox door, which had always latched perfectly, began hanging open, screws loosened in a way that felt deliberate. Then came the nights. At first, it was just strange noises, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel when I was sure no one was outside, or the rustle of bushes near my windows long after midnight. I told myself it was animals, wind, anything but what it really was, someone prowling too close, watching. One night, I decided to test my suspicion. I left my porch light on and sat in the dark living room, waiting. Sure enough, just past midnight, a shadow drifted across the edge of my yard. The figure paused, glanced toward the house, then quickly disappeared into the night. My stomach clenched. I didn't need to see a face to know who was behind it. Karen's harassment had evolved. She wasn't just finding me anymore. She was intruding into my life, inch by inch, trying to make me feel unsafe in my own home. That was when I decided I couldn't just sit back. If she wanted to play this game, I was going to start keeping score. I bought a small notebook and began documenting everything. Dates, times, exact wording of letters, and even photographs of notices taped to my door. I installed a security camera, angled toward the yard, hoping to catch whoever was skulking around at night. Every click of the pen, every snapshot, every entry felt like a small piece of control slipping back into my hands. But just as quickly as I found resolve, the intimidation escalated. One morning, I woke to find a bright red spray-painted message scrawled across my trash bin: "Follow the rules." My chest tightened as I stared at it, the words glaring back like a direct threat. There was no subtlety anymore. Whoever did it wanted me to feel cornered, humiliated. I reported it to the HOA, hoping, foolishly, that they might take it seriously. Instead, I received another letter. This one claimed that graffiti on community property was a violation and that I was responsible for the damage. Not only did they ignore the harassment, but they also blamed me for it. That was the breaking point. The fear that had been eating away at me hardened into something else: anger. Karen wanted me scared, wanted me submissive. But I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. From that moment forward, I vowed to fight, no matter how long it took or how messy it got. Still, even as I told myself I was ready, I couldn't ignore the creeping dread. Because deep down, I knew that if she was willing to vandalize, to stalk, and to twist the system against me, she was capable of worse. Much worse. And soon she would prove it. Now, my home didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like enemy territory. Every day brought something new, some fresh reminder that I wasn't safe, that Karen wasn't finished. The graffiti on the trash bin was only the beginning. Soon after, I came home from work to find a notice stuck under my windshield wiper, not an official HOA letter, but a scrap of paper with the words, "Leave, before you're forced out." The handwriting was jagged and rushed, like whoever wrote it couldn't contain their anger long enough to be neat. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a rulebook war anymore. This was personal hatred. When I tried to bring the evidence to the HOA board, they brushed it aside. One of them even smirked, muttering that I shouldn't take everything so personally. Meanwhile, Karen sat there stone-faced, her silence louder than words. I realized then that she wasn't acting alone. The board, or at least parts of it, was backing her. The fines grew impossible. I was billed hundreds for unapproved modifications, after repainting my shutters in the same color they had always been. A demand came in for driveway restoration, complete with an outrageous deadline. And then, the most absurd of them all, a violation for excessive use of security cameras. The very cameras I had installed to protect myself were now considered a breach of HOA guidelines. It was suffocating. Every choice I made was twisted into another weapon against me. And then came the night that changed everything. I woke to the faint crackle of sound outside my window, followed by the smell, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. My heart slammed in my chest as I bolted upright, rushing to the window. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw it. A glow, faint but growing, near the side of my house. Flames licking upward, spreading fast. Panic surged through me as I scrambled for the phone, dialing emergency services with shaking hands. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the blaze had already taken hold. The heat was unbearable, the smoke choking. My neighbors poured into the street, some clutching their children, others just watching in stunned silence as the flames devoured everything I had built. And in the crowd I saw her. Karen stood a few houses down, arms folded, her expression unreadable. While others gasped and whispered, she just stared at the burning wreckage, her eyes glinting in the firelight. I'll never forget that look. The fire consumed my home, leaving behind nothing but charred remains and ashes. The place I had fought so hard to protect was gone in a single night. But as I stood there, coughing in the smoke, heart pounding with shock and rage, I didn't realize yet that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because just 1 week later, when I walked into a courtroom, I would see her again, not across the street this time, but sitting directly in front of me. When the smoke finally cleared, I stood on the edge of what used to be my home. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of charred wood and melted plastic, a smell that clung to my clothes, my skin, and my very soul. Firefighters moved around me with quiet efficiency, their flashlights cutting across the blackened skeleton of walls that once held laughter, warmth, and dreams. It didn't feel real. Hours earlier, I'd been asleep in my bed. Now, that bed was nothing more than twisted springs poking through piles of ash. The kitchen where I had brewed coffee each morning was a hollow ruin. The living room, where I had once sat surrounded by plans for the future, was gone. Every trace of normal life had been erased in a single night. Neighbors whispered in clusters across the street, their voices low but sharp, eyes darting toward me. Some looked sympathetic, pity etched on their faces. Others seemed almost cautious, as though standing too close to me might bring the same misfortune to their doorstep. And among them, like a shadow cast in human form, stood Karen. Arms folded. Expression unreadable. Watching. Insurance adjusters came and went, clipboards in hand, their words like cold stones. Extensive damage, investigation pending, unlikely to recover full value. Each phrase drove the knife deeper. The home I had fought so hard for, the sanctuary I had dreamed of, had been reduced to a case number. For days, I drifted through the motions, answering questions, signing forms, trying to salvage scraps of memory from the rubble. But beneath the grief, something else began to grow. It was sharp, steady, undeniable anger. I couldn't shake the image of her watching as my house burned, her eyes reflecting the flames. I couldn't ignore the months of harassment, the fines, and the intimidation that had led to this. It was no longer about violations or rules. It was about destruction. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The turning point came when a letter arrived, not from the HOA this time, but from the court. The HOA had filed a complaint against me, claiming unpaid fines and damages, demanding restitution even after I had lost everything. The irony was almost laughable. They had watched my life burn to the ground, and now they wanted to finish the job by dragging me into court. I should have felt defeated. But instead, I felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't their courtroom. It was mine. This was my chance to stand in the light, to show the truth, to tear off the mask Karen had hidden behind for so long. I gathered everything I had, the notebook filled with dates and details, photos of every notice taped to my door, security footage of shadows prowling at night, and the spray-painted thread on my trash bin. Every piece of evidence was a weapon, each one forged in the fire of months of torment. The morning of the hearing, I stood in the courthouse hallway, clutching a folder thick with those papers. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what this moment meant. This wasn't just about me. It was about every person who had been silenced, bullied, and cornered by people like her. The doors opened. The bailiff called my case. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. And there she was. Karen sat at the opposite table, polished and composed, her expression cool and confident. She looked at me as if she had already won, as if the fire had erased not just my house but also my will to fight. But she was wrong. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't walking into her arena. She was walking into mine. Courtroom was colder than I expected. Bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bouncing off polished wood and stacks of files that seemed to tower like monuments to bureaucracy. I sat at one table, my folder of evidence resting in front of me like a lifeline. Across the aisle, Karen sat with the HOA's attorney, calm, collected, and her posture straight as if she were already delivering a victory speech in her head. The judge entered, and everyone rose. My pulse thundered in my ears. The HOA's attorney wasted no time. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket, and launched into a speech dripping with rehearsed authority. According to him, I was a negligent homeowner, a disruptive force in the community. He spoke of unpaid fines, repeated violations, and my so-called refusal to cooperate with the HOA's efforts to maintain harmony. Each word was designed to paint me as reckless, irresponsible, and even dangerous. Karen nodded occasionally, her lips curving into the faintest smirk. To anyone who didn't know better, it might have seemed convincing. But I knew the truth. And soon everyone else would too. When it was my turn, I stood. My legs felt heavy, but the weight in my chest pushed me forward. I began carefully and methodically laying out the timeline. The first letter is about the garden gnomes. The sudden escalation of fines. The nitpicking about paint shades that weren't even different. The accusations that defied logic. At first, the board members shifted in their seats with practiced indifference. But then I opened my folder. One by one, I laid the photographs on the table where the judge could see. The spray-painted trash bin, bright red words screaming, "Follow the rules." The security footage, a shadow lurking at the edge of my yard, circling like a predator. The vandalized mailbox. The notices were taped to my door at odd hours of the night. The courtroom grew quieter with every piece of evidence. Karen's smirk wavered. The HOA's attorney tried to object, claiming irrelevance, but the judge leaned forward, brow furrowed. "If these materials are authentic," he said, "then they speak directly to the credibility of the plaintiff's claims." That was the first crack. I didn't stop there. I produced the notebook, page after page of handwritten entries, each one dated, each one recording the harassment with meticulous detail. I read passages aloud, the late-night footsteps, the noises outside my windows, and the intimidation tactics that made my own home feel like a prison. The tension in the room shifted. What began as their confident attack was turning into a defense. Karen's posture stiffened. She crossed her arms, eyes narrowing, her confidence thinning with each revelation. It wasn't just my word against hers anymore. It was documentation, patterns, and proof. The attorney scrambled to regain footing, insisting the HOA acted only in the best interests of the community. But the more he spoke, the hollower it sounded. And then came the moment I had been waiting for. I pulled out a single sheet, a copy of the notice blaming me for the graffiti on my own trash bin. I held it up for the judge to see. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is the perfect example of how far they went. Someone vandalized my property with a threatening message, and instead of protecting me, the HOA fined me for it. They turned a crime against me into a punishment. They knew exactly what was happening, and they let it continue." The judge's eyes lingered on the page, his expression unreadable. But I saw the shift. The balance was tipping. Karen avoided my gaze now, staring at the table as though she could will herself invisible. Her silence was louder than any argument. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. Because the most damning evidence, the piece that would turn suspicion into certainty, was still waiting in my folder. And when it came out, there would be no smirks, no denials, and no hiding. The air in the courtroom had shifted. What began as their stage was no longer theirs to command. The HOA's attorney sat rigid, his arguments unraveling thread by thread. Karen, once so composed, was shrinking into herself, her arms crossed tightly as though she could shield her pride from the blows landing around her. And I hadn't even shown my final card. I reached into my folder and pulled out a small USB drive. The judge raised an eyebrow as I handed it to the bailiff, who connected it to the court's projector. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy black and white footage from my security camera. The first clip was simple, shadows moving near my fence at midnight. The figure paused, crouched, and tampered with something unseen. Then, the following morning, I discovered the damaged mailbox. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The second clip was even clearer. It showed the same figure creeping across my lawn, the outline unmistakably matching Karen's build, her walk, her posture. She glanced around, tugged at my trash bin, and disappeared into the night. And then came the third clip, the one I had replayed 100 times in disbelief. It was the night of the fire. The footage showed the side of my house, dimly lit by the porch light. A figure approached, carrying something in their hands. They lingered by the siding, crouched low, and then a faint spark ignited. Within seconds, the glow grew brighter, spreading hungrily upward. The figure stood, looked back at the house, then walked swiftly away. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint buzz of the projector. Every eye was locked on the screen. Karen's face drained of color. She shifted in her chair, her composure cracking like glass under pressure. Her attorney leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she didn't respond. Her hands trembled in her lap. The judge leaned back, his expression grim. "Mrs. Karen," he said slowly, "do you care to explain what we just saw?" All eyes turned to her. For the first time, the mask slipped completely. She stammered, fumbling for words, her usual sharpness gone. That could be anyone, she muttered, but her voice shook. The footage is grainy. It's not proof. But it was too late. The damage was done. The attorney tried to object, but his words sounded desperate, flimsy. The judge silenced him with a single wave of the hand. The evidence spoke for itself. Whispers rippled through the courtroom, board members whispering to each other, neighbors who had come to watch exchanging stunned looks. The woman who had lorded over the neighborhood with an iron grip, who had terrorized me for months, was now exposed in the harshest light imaginable. I stood there, my heart pounding, not with fear but with something else, vindication. For the first time, the weight I'd carried began to lift. The judge's gavel came down once, sharp and final. We will recess to consider charges beyond this civil matter. But let me be clear, this evidence is deeply troubling. This is no longer about fines or HOA rules. This is about criminal conduct. Karen's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The once untouchable queen of the HOA now looked small, cornered, and utterly powerless. I didn't smile. There was no joy in this moment, no triumph in seeing a life unravel. But there was justice. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Still, as the bailiff collected the evidence and the judge rose from the bench, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't over. Because if someone like Karen could burn a house to the ground, what would she do now that she had been unmasked in front of everyone? The courtroom doors closed behind me, and I realized the battle was won. But the war and its consequences were only beginning. The judge's gavel fell for the final time that day. It echoed in my chest like thunder. The sound didn't just signal the end of a hearing, it marked the collapse of the power Karen had wielded for so long. She remained seated at the plaintiff's table, staring straight ahead, her expression hollow. Her attorney shuffled papers nervously, avoiding her gaze. For months she had ruled the neighborhood with fear, hiding behind fine print and bureaucracy. But now, with the evidence laid bare for everyone to see, there was no shield left. The whispers in the courtroom swelled into open murmurs as neighbors filed out, stealing glances at her. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and quiet admiration. It was over, at least in that room. But outside those walls, I still had to live with the ashes of what she had done. The days after the hearing felt surreal. Investigators combed through what remained of my home, collecting samples, photographing every charred corner. Insurance adjusters returned. Their tone changed now that the fire was no longer suspicious damage, but evidence of a crime. They spoke cautiously, their words heavy with the acknowledgement that I had been wronged. And the community, once silent, began to shift. People who had never spoken to me before stopped by as I sifted through the rubble. One elderly neighbor brought a thermos of coffee, her hands shaking as she admitted she had always feared Karen but admired the way I had stood up to her. A younger couple offered to help clear debris, explaining that they too had felt trapped under the HOA's thumb but never dared to resist. Their words were kind, but they didn't erase the sight of my destroyed home. Each day I returned to the property, walking through the blackened remains, my boots crunching over broken glass and ash. I salvaged what little I could, a warped picture frame, a half-melted mug, and a singed page from an old book. They were fragments, reminders of a life that had been stolen. And yet, beneath the grief, there was a spark of resolve. I began to meet with contractors, discussing what could be rebuilt. The numbers were overwhelming and the timeline was daunting, but for the first time since the fire, I wasn't paralyzed. Rebuilding wasn't just about replacing walls and windows, it was about reclaiming what Karen had tried to take from me, my right to live without fear. The HOA, once so arrogant, was now in shambles. Board members resigned quietly, slipping out before the storm of public scrutiny fully hit. Meetings that had once been tense displays of authority now dissolved into awkward silences and half-hearted apologies. The community had seen too much, and trust was shattered. And Karen. News spread quickly about the charges being filed against her. Neighbors whispered about her house, how the blinds were always drawn now, and how her once proud garden sat neglected and overgrown. She no longer strutted through the neighborhood with her clipboard, no longer barked orders about weeds or trash bins. Instead, she became a shadow of herself, the woman who had tried to control everyone reduced to a cautionary tale. Still, her absence didn't erase the damage she left behind. I lay awake at night replaying the fire, the sound of crackling wood, the glow of flames climbing higher, and the image of her standing in the street as everything I owned turned to smoke. The memory burned just as fiercely as the fire itself. But I refused to let it define me. Standing on the foundation of what used to be my home, I looked at the cleared space and the fresh stacks of lumber and supplies waiting to rebuild. For months, that place had been a battleground. Now it was a canvas. A chance to start over. And though the scars would always remain, both on the land and inside me, the act of rebuilding was its own victory. Karen had tried to reduce me to rubble, but instead, she had given me the fire I needed to rise again. Rebuilding a house takes time, patience, and more resilience than I thought I had. But rebuilding trust in a community broken by fear takes something even harder: courage. As the months passed, construction crews hammered, sawed, and pieced my home back together. Walls rose where there had been only rubble, and new beams stood where smoke had once choked the air. Every nail driven into wood felt like an act of defiance, proof that Karen hadn't won. But while my house was being rebuilt, Karen's world was falling apart. The evidence presented in court didn't vanish when the hearing ended. Prosecutors filed criminal charges, and suddenly, the woman who had once terrorized neighbors with violation slips was facing something she couldn't bully her way out of: the law. Word spread quickly, and the same community she had lorded over turned its back on her. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. Her once pristine yard grew wild, weeds creeping where roses once bloomed. I heard whispers. Her family stopped visiting, her friends distanced themselves, and her position on the HOA was stripped. She wasn't the queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was its cautionary tale. And the HOA itself? It cracked under the weight of scandal. Board members scrambled to resign, fearing their own roles might be scrutinized. At emergency meetings, residents who had once sat silently now stood tall, demanding reforms. Rules were rewritten, fines reduced, and oversight put in place to prevent abuse of power. For the first time, the HOA was forced to serve the community instead of controlling it. The shift was dramatic. Children played freely in yards where parents had once worried about citations. Neighbors planted gardens without fear of punishment. Laughter returned to the streets, cautious at first, then steady and strong. I became something unexpected, a symbol. People approached me not just with sympathy but with gratitude. They told me my fight had given them courage, that standing up to Karen had reminded them they weren't powerless. It was humbling and, in a way, healing. But even as life settled into something resembling peace, the scars remained. Every night when I locked my doors, I still glanced at the shadows outside. Every time I heard a strange noise in the dark, my chest tightened. Trauma doesn't disappear just because justice is served. It lingers, quiet but sharp, a reminder of what was lost. And yet, I wouldn't change what I did. Because if Karen had taught me anything, it was that silence only feeds tyranny. Bullies thrive when no one stands against them. By fighting back, by refusing to be erased, I didn't just protect myself. I exposed the cracks in a system that had allowed someone like her to rise unchecked. Months later, I stood on my rebuilt porch as the sun dipped low, casting a warm glow across the street. Kids laughed as they rode bikes past, neighbors waved as they carried groceries in, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the neighborhood looked normal. But the question lingered in my mind, one I couldn't shake, one I wanted everyone who heard my story to ask themselves. What would you do if the very people meant to protect your community turned against you? Would you stay silent, or would you fight? Because in the end, that choice defines everything.